All right, so we've got sort of our day 4 PowerPoint here, where we are working through the cardiovascular side of things. Since we've already talked about extracting oxygen, today we're talking about let's move that oxygen around. So our objectives are to understand what's going to constitute our cardiovascular system and the functions of the cardiovascular system. We will also talk about how the heart actually works. And so that's going to involve like electrical excitation, which is fun to say, but basically we got to look at like how your heart is going to generate its own electric signals. And that's going to cause your heart to actually beat. We'll talk about the different parts of the different factors that give cardiac output, like looking at like heart rate versus like stroke volume, that's the overall performance of your heart. And then we will talk about a little bit about like tying that all together to the oxygen stuff that we talked about yesterday, VO2 max and things like that. And we will also talk about the blood pressure as well. So we'll talk about ventricular systole, blood flow, and things like that. So your cardiovascular system is going to be comprised of your heart. It is your blood and your blood vessels. So that's the system coming together here. In the same way that the respiratory system was, the respiratory pump and the respiratory passageways, the pump being things like the diaphragm and the lungs themselves, and the passageways being all the tubes that are running through it. The cardiovascular system, three main components, or three only components, are the heart, which is sort of powering everything, the blood, which is, carrying everything around, and the blood vessels, which are allowing the blood somewhere to travel. And it's responsible for providing a delivery system of nutrients, not only in the form of like proteins, fats, and carbs, but also in the form of like oxygen and water throughout the body. And then it also needs to be able to generate and maintain its own pressure. Being able to generate and maintain its own pressure is really the only thing that your heart is most concerned with, right? Like that is that organ's job, it is to generate pressure and, be able to maintain that. So we talked a lot about pressure yesterday, right? We talked about like pressure gradients, and we also talked about concentration gradients, right? So a pressure gradient would be if there's like a lack of volume here, air is going to rush to where, if there's a lack of space here, air is going to rush to where there is plenty of open space, right? That's a pressure gradient. And that's why, things move the way they do. Well, there's also concentration gradients like we talked about yesterday as well, right? If there's a lot of oxygen over here and very little oxygen over here, nature, hating gradients, will naturally move oxygen that way. So pressure gradients causes air to move. Air is, nitrogen, oxygen, boron, all that stuff. Carbon dioxide. And then oxygen moves because of a concentration gradient. O2, oxygen molecules, to where there is not one, or CO2 to where there is not some. Well, the same thing is true here, except that we have sort of a liquid pressure gradient. We're going back to pressure gradients, right? And this is going to be your blood, right? Your blood is going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. And that's what we want. So we want our heart to be able to generate and maintain that pressure. And by moving that blood around, that's going to help you maintain your body temperature, which is really nice. It's going to remove excess heat. If you were to like get really hot in one particular area, luckily your blood is rushing around your body. So it's going to kind of carry that heat evenly throughout your body, which is really nice. Although, not helpful if you're just, sweating like crazy all day and you're hot all over. Your body will try its best to kind of regulate that. Because you remember like blood, if you think about like what is happening during like, goosebumps, for instance, right? That is your body trying to warm itself up. And so your skin is contracting and then the hairs on your arm are all raising up, and then you're getting this like bumpy texture. And what that does is when air rushes over your skin, it creates a little bit of friction, which will heat you up, which is really nice. But your blood will also move away from the surface of your skin because it's trying to maintain the temperature that you have already, and it's trying to hold on to it. If you're really hot, the exact opposite happens. Your pores open up and obviously you start sweating and stuff. And that way, when air rushes over your skin, it can cool you down. Well, now blood is going to rush up to the surface, and blood will actually be closer to the surface of your skin. And that way, when that cool air rushes by, it can grab that lower temperature and hopefully carry that around your body. And that's why we sweat, which yours truly does a lot of, by the way. That's a big part of, like, heat and sweat and things like that. And then also monitoring your pH levels. Blood is going to help you regulate pH by moving, very acidic and very base things throughout the body. It's also going to distribute oxygen and nutrients. And that's the big one that we're going to spend most of our time talking about, right? Nutrients like glucose and amino acids and fats, absolutely. But oxygen is probably the big one where our conversation is going to be centered today. So looking at your heart is going to be comprised, it's this big, like I said, this muscular blood pumping organ that's responsible for, generating and maintaining that pressure, right? That's exactly what we were just talking about. And so it actually lives in this little sac that's called your pericardium, which is this little sac that basically, holds your heart in the place where it's supposed to be held. It's not officially part of your heart itself. There we go. That's kind of interesting picture, drawing it in green. But yeah, no, where'd it go? Where did the picture go? I lost it. There it is. So it's this little sac that kind of encloses your heart, and it's got connective tissue that allows it to, like, remain attached to where we want it to stay attached. If you've ever heard of Marfan syndrome, this is actually a condition where you will have, like, weaker than average connective tissue. And sometimes you can see, like, these are really extreme drawings of this. If you've ever seen somebody who has, like, a dent in their chest cavity, or sometimes looks like this, that's a sign of Marfan syndrome, and it's a connective tissue disorder. And they will often be, they'll often have really long limbs, and they'll be really flexible, which is often, if they're not, like, if they're still very athletic, you'll often see these people play a lot of, like, basketball growing up because they're very tall. But the NBA actually does a genetic test to check for Marfan syndrome. And the reason they do that, and people they'll end up usually going to play in Europe and stuff, but they won't let you play in the NBA if you have Marfan's. And the reason for that, I know it seems like it comes back to the cardiovascular system, is because the connective tissue that holds your pericardium, which holds your heart in place, could be weaker than it's supposed to. So if you take, like, a really hard hit while you're playing, like, the sport, your heart could literally fall off, which is not something we want to have happen. Like I said, it's actually, honestly, it's pretty rare. Like, it doesn't really happen all that often, but you'll hear, like, of people in the NBA, they'll try out for the NBA, they find out they have Marfan's, they went their whole life without kind of realizing it. And then all of a sudden, they're like, well, you can't play in the NBA, so they'll just go over to, like, a European league and play there instead. That happened a couple of years ago. There was a guy, it was really cool. I think he was with the 76ers. I'm not 100% sure, but they knew that he had this condition. He was, like, really high in the draft. He was honestly, I think, in the first round. But then he found out he wasn't eligible to play, which is such a bummer. And I think the 76ers, I think they drafted him and then they retired him instantly. So it was, like, kind of ceremonious, but I always thought that was really cool. I was like, good on you. This kid's probably wanted to be in the NBA his whole life. And like I said, now he plays over in a European league. But so anyway, that's your pericardium. It's this fibrous sac that kind of holds your heart in place. And then you've got the heart itself. Your heart has these 4 chambers inside of it. Like we were talking about in the video that we just watched, right? Like, obviously there's fish have got the 2 chambers, certain, like, reptiles and stuff will have 3 chambers. We've got the 4, right? Most mammals are going to have 4. I just looked it up. I was kind of curious. I was like, which animal has the most chambers? Apparently bees have 5. So that's one more reason for me to dislike bees and weirdos. Sorry, I don't like bees. So 4 chambers here, what we're going to see in the typical, like, human heart, right? And so these chambers are what allow blood to like return to the heart and then get to where it needs to go, where the heart can again generate and maintain that pressure. And then these chambers have valves on them that are actually responsible for creating that pressure. So these valves are really good at like closing down while the heart squeezes. And just like if you were to take like a water bottle with the lid on it and you squeeze as hard as you can, the lid's on there, there's a lot of pressure in the bottle, but it's not going to be released unless you take that cap off and then comes shooting out like very violently, right? Well, that's kind of how your heart ejects blood. It's got these different little chambers there. So you can see here, I wanted to, we actually don't have the chambers listed up here in the PowerPoint, but I did want to get them up here. I don't think you're tested on them in this course, but they come up next mod, so I wanted to mention them now. So if we look at the 4 chambers of the heart, you're going to divide them into 2 primary sections. There's my picture. This is always my favorite one. You can see there's kind of it's making a big figure 8 here, right? And so it's divided into a left side and a right side, and it's divided into a top and a bottom. And you'll notice the left is on the right and the right is on the left in the picture which you're looking at. I know that's a little weird, but remember the reason for that is like this is from the perspective of this person's heart. So it's their left arm, you know, their left arm, left atrium, and their left ventricle, which is obviously on our right if we're looking at them. Always a good thing to remember because, you know, constantly when we're doing fitness assessments, you know, like the right foot turns out, you got to remember it's your client's right foot. So that could be your left. Don't forget to do that. So here's the chambers, right? We've got a left side and a right side, and we've got the top and we've got the bottom. Okay, so the top chambers are going to be what are called your atria. And that's the plural for atriums. So you've got a left atrium and you've got a right atrium. And if you look up the word atrium, basically what it means is it's a gathering site. Like if I just look up atrium, you'll see like, you know, it's an area where people will like come. It's usually like a big open chamber where people can like gather, right? And so you'll see like atriums are always like in big hotel lobbies and things like that. And so in the heart, it's a chamber that gathers blood that has returned back from the heart, right? So in your left atrium, this is, you know, when we're drawing this in bright red, the reason we're doing that is because this is highly oxygenated blood. You can see these 2 tubes right here coming from both sides like this. Those are your pulmonary veins. And this is actually where blood is returning back to your heart into the left atrium here. This is coming from your lungs. So this is where those blood cells are going to have as much oxygen as they are ever going to have, right? They just got back from the lungs. They have tons of oxygen. And so then the left atrium is going to drop into your left ventricle. And your left ventricle, a ventricle is in charge of like pumping blood out of the heart. So we have a right atrium and a left atrium. We have a left ventricle and a right ventricle, right? And so the left side is attached to each other and the right side is attached to each other, and then they are separated in the middle there. So the left atrium, which is gathering all that highly oxygenated blood that just came back from the lungs, drops that blood into the left ventricle, and then the valve slams shut. And when that happens, when that valve slams shut and then the heart squeezes, it creates a heartbeat. What'll happen is pressure builds up, and then all of a sudden, you actually can't see it in this picture here, but this little valve over here, which was also shut, then opens up and that blood goes rushing right out of here, right? This little valve, right, rushes out of there, and then it'll kind of circle up under the above the heart and then drop behind it. And then some of it'll go up to the brain, right? But like, this is your aorta here, and this is where blood is getting ejected. This is where blood pressure is the highest in your body because it's literally coming right out of the heart right in that moment. And so shoots out of there and it travels down to, you know, your right pinky toe, which is about as far away from the heart as you could possibly get, you know, or maybe it travels against gravity up to your brain, you know, pretty challenging journeys there, right? So the left atrium gathers the oxygenated blood, and then it travels into the left ventricle where the heart will beat, and then that will eject the blood out of the heart and it will travel to wherever it is going. So The left atrium, like I said, gathering oxygenated blood. It's returning from the lungs. The right atrium is the other side of things, right? The right atrium is responsible for gathering blood that has returned from the body. So let's say that blood traveled down to your right big toe and it dropped off all of its oxygen and kept your right big toe alive. And then it gets sucked all the way back up to the heart. Well, it's got to get gathered in the heart before it can get pumped to the lungs. And so that's why we have our right atrium. And so you actually, again, can't see it in this version, but you can kind of see it right here, these two little open sections. There's blood that's returning from the upper body. There's blood that's returning from the lower body back into the heart. This is your superior for above vena cava. This is your inferior for below vena cava. And they are basically really, really, really big veins. And veins always travel back to the heart. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But so blood gets gathered back up in that right atrium. And then again, this valve is closed, but then the valve opens up. And so all that blood rushes into the right ventricle. The valve will shut again. The heart will squeeze. And when the heart squeezes, that will eject that blood out and it will travel over to the lungs to become oxygenated. So the left atrium gathers blood that's returned from the lungs, and the right atrium gathers blood that has, oh, that's right, that's why I keep that one, that is returned from the body. And then the left atrium is connected to the left ventricle, which pushes that oxygenated blood out to the rest of the body. And then your right ventricle pushes deoxygenated blood over to the lungs. Now I put the left ventricle here in italics because honestly, that's probably the one that we are most going to pay attention to in our jobs. Like for instance, when you're checking someone's pulse, right? You are feeling, you're measuring when their left ventricle is contracting, because that's the left ventricle is the one that's ejecting blood throughout the body, right? That's the hardest working part of the heart. And you can even see if you look at this picture of the heart, right, especially on this side, notice how much more muscle is around this chamber compared to how much muscle is around this chamber. The right ventricle only has to pump blood over to the lungs. It's a couple inches, right? But the left ventricle, like I said, has to push it over to your right big toe, which is not close. So it's much, much, much more muscular. And that's what we're feeling when we're feeling someone's pulse. We're feeling the left ventricle contract. Those are the chambers of the heart. So let's go through that one more time, and we'll do it with a brand new red blood cell. Let's say it's a red blood cell that has never existed before. It's born into the world, and it's going to make its very first journey to the heart. So this blood cell is probably created in your femur or something, and then it gets into the bloodstream. And it's going to travel up, and it's a deoxygenated blood cell. It's never been to the lungs before. So the first place it's going to go is the right atrium. So it's going to get gathered in the right atrium there. And then that's the first trip it's ever had to the heart. And then it's going to get to drop down into the right ventricle. And then it will be pumped over to the lungs. Let's say it goes up and gets sucked through this one, right? So now it's going to pick up oxygen for the very first time in its little red blood cell life. And then it's going to get sucked back into the heart, where it will go into your left atrium. And now it's got all this oxygen, so it's got to get out to the body and deliver it. So then it gathers in the left atrium, where it will drop into the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, and it will travel up to, let's say, the brain, drops off all of its oxygen, picks up some CO2. Now it's a deoxygenated CO2 heavy red blood cell. So what does it have to do? It's got to get back to the lungs. So it goes back to the right atrium, right ventricle, to lungs, left atrium, left ventricle, and then this time maybe it travels down to your glutes and drops off some oxygen so you can do your squats, picks up some CO2, atrium, ventricle, lungs, atrium, ventricle, body. Heart to lungs to heart to body to heart to lungs to heart to body. And that is how blood sort of travels around. Any questions on any of that? Comments or concerns?
Say it again. Heart to lungs, lungs to, say it again.
Heart to lungs to heart to body.
Okay.
Heart to lungs to heart to body. Yeah. It's always got to go back to the dispatch. So it's always got to get back to the heart in the middle. And that's kind of the figure eight, right? Like through and then, here and then back through and then back up, right? Heart, lungs, heart, body, heart, lungs, heart, body. And again, and by the way, and if you ever need to memorize these chambers, and honestly, guys, they'll probably only ask you about the left ventricle because that's the one that is everything, right? The left ventricle is whenever you have problems, it's because you can't get blood out of the left ventricle to your body, right, to wherever it's going. So the left ventricle is the one that we pay most of our attention to. Memorize that one before you memorize any of the other parts of the heart. The left ventricle, which pumps blood that is oxygenated out to the body, because then you can sort of logic square out the other ones just out of context clues, right? You're like, okay, the left ventricle pumped blood to the body. If it's going to the body, it needs to be oxygenated, right? Like that's what's going to allow me to do my work, right? So then that means that it just came back from the lungs, and the left ventricle would be attached to that'd be the left atrium. So now you've got half the heart finished, and you just figured it out basically by remembering one thing. And then you're like, all right, well, what's the opposite of going to the body? Going to the lungs. So that must be what my right ventricle does. And then if that's gathering, if that's got to go to the lungs, then it must be blood that's coming back from the body, and it's got to get gathered. So that right ventricle would be attached to the right atrium. So you can kind of just like, if you have the one memorized, you can sit there and think about it for a second, and it will give you the other three chambers, as long as you remember sort of how the whole thing functions, as a concept. So those, not an English teacher, are the chambers of your heart. All right, so now your heart is also comprised of several different layers of muscle, and that's what's really, one of the coolest parts of your heart. Is this going to give me what I want? If I look up heart layers, yeah, it does. Okay, so your heart muscle is actually comprised of a lot of different layers. You can actually kind of see these different layers here. There's a little bit of fat on the inside actually there. And then there's a really thick muscular one, and then there's the endo on the inside. So this is where we're going to see some prefixes that you're going to probably get pretty familiar with here. But you are going to have the epicardium. That is your outermost layer. I believe epi stands for like epicenter. It means the outside most. And so that's your epicardium. It's the outer layer that is really kind of visceral on the outside, but also kind of protective on the inside, which is really good. This is going to protect us by having an outer layer, but it's also really viscous on the outside. It's very slick on the outside, which is really important because remember, there's a sac on the outside of the heart that's not necessarily part of the heart. And we don't want to get anything stuck to that sac. So the pericardium's innermost layer and the epicardium's outermost layer are both very slick. In fact, you can actually make them less slick if you ever get a condition known as pericarditis, which is basically where you get an infection in between those layers. And then like fluid gets in there, and that fluid screws up how slick it is. And so then like your heart is like trying to squeeze, but it's like being stuck in a net, and it's like I can't open and I can't move the way I'm supposed to move, and that's bad. So that's not great. So that's your epicardium. It's the outermost layer, and then actually I'm gonna skip myocardium. We'll come back to that in just a second. Then you get in the endocardium. Endo means innermost. That's the inner layer of the heart. And that is like all of the inner chamber, when you think about like the innermost layers here, like the chambers, right? This is also super, 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 super smooth. Your endocardium, you can even see like the way they're drawing it here. It's very, very smooth, which is important because we don't want your red blood cells to get stuck to the wall. If there was like a lot of texture there, a blood cell might park itself on the wall of your heart and then start to clot, and then it would stay there, right? And that's definitely not something we want to have happen. So the inner chamber of your heart, the endocardium, is also very smooth. Not necessarily slick, but smooth. There's a slight difference there. And then you get your myocardium, which is this really thick layer. And again, if they're going to ask you a question, they're probably going to ask you a question about the myocardium, because the myocardium is the workhorse of your heart. This is the thick muscular layer that does all of the contracting, right? And so your myocardium, the middle layer of the heart, is extremely muscular and very thick when we compare it to your other layers. So you can kind of see, right? We've got the epicardium on the outside, the endocardium on the inside, and then there's all this thick myocardium in the middle, and then the whole heart would be surrounded by the pericardium around the perimeter of it, right? So those are the different layers of your heart. Now, when we're talking about myocardium, you'll also sometimes hear that referred to as like cardiac muscle. And we're not necessarily spending a ton of time talking about cardiac muscle today, but I always like to mention it because you've got 3 different muscle fiber types inside of your body. There's the one that we're probably most familiar with, which is your skeletal muscle. You can see that right here. And look at how thick you got a dark red and you get the kind of light pink. Look at how thick those are, those little bands. Those are like, we call those striations, okay? And those striations are where you're basically seeing like actin and myosin proteins overlapping, which is why skeletal muscle can make really, really, really strong contractions, like you can lift a 100-pound barbell over your head with skeletal muscle. It can't do that with the other types of muscles in the body. Especially smooth muscle, which you can see here, does not have any striations at all. Smooth muscle is really not that good at contracting. I mean, it's good enough to move food, from here to here, and then it'll, squeeze that and kind of move that food, via peristalsis and stuff. But like smooth muscle is not meant for like heavy contractions. This is why it's so painful when you eat too big of a bite and you feel like moving down. It's like your smooth muscles going like, yeah, I'm not supposed to stretch this much, right? And it's uncomfortable feeling. And then you've got cardiac muscle, which we're spending today talking about. So this has like some striations. You can see them right now. Don't mistake striations for these thick, these kind of dark lines you're seeing here. The stripes going this way, right? These striations going this way along the strands, right? So you're seeing really thick striations in skeletal muscle. You're seeing really thin striations in cardiac muscle. So this is pretty good at contracting, similar to skeletal muscle, but it's not as good at contracting. It's not gonna be able to generate as much force, but it's really not supposed to. But because it's meant to be better at just contracting consistently over extremely long periods of time. Say, oh, I don't know, 80 or 90 years. I don't know about you guys, but I can't do biceps for 80 or 90 years, bicep curls for 80 or 90 years. But my heart sure can keep working the whole time. So you can see, right? These are also, you'll also notice these little purple dots on everything. Those are nuclei or nucleuses. It's nuclei. You'll see there's actually less nuclei in your cardiac muscles. And if you remember what a nucleus is, it's the brain of a cell, right? It tells the cells what to do. We do not want too many cooks in the kitchen when it comes to cardiac muscle. We actually don't want too many brains, because then they're all going to start nerding out over things and talking about stuff and debating and all. And we're just like, no. We just want to consistently beat. We don't need to reinvent anything today, brainiacs, right? So your cardiac muscle is very tightly packed compared to skeletal muscle. It has less nuclei compared to skeletal muscle. And that allows it, when one muscle fiber contracts, it drags all the other muscle fibers with it. So your heart muscle is extremely, extremely good at contracting all at once. What does that make it very good at? Well, going back to our conversation we had yesterday and today, it makes it very, very good at generating and maintaining pressure. And that is the big thing that your heart does, right? It is generating as much pressure as possible. Let me really quickly. Yeah, okay, good. So, how are we doing so far, guys? Questions, comments? Didn't get lost in the weeds with the muscle fiber types?
All good.
Cool. All right. So speaking of pressure, what's it supposed to be? What should our blood pressure be around? Well, in general, I'm actually looking to see if this shows up later. Yeah, here we go. In general, it should be around 120/80. That's sort of our ideal pressure in terms of like blood pressure throughout the body. Now, that's actually going to be a little bit different um, depending on like your how good of shape you're in and things like that. But that's different than the amount of pressure in terms of like how much blood is in your heart. So there is a slight difference between like blood pressure, which is your blood vessel pressure. It is part of the cardiorespiratory system, and your blood's volume inside the chambers of your heart. Okay. Ideally, the volume inside your heart at the end of like diastole, which is the relaxation of your heart, should be about 130 milliliters of blood. So if your heart like relaxes and there's a ton of blood inside because it relaxes, the chambers are empty, and your body's like, is that an empty chamber? Blood flows into it, right? Because again, nature will always move something from a high pressure to low pressure, right? There's a bunch of empty space. Blood's going to naturally move that way. You'll have about 100, if you were to dump it all out, about 130 milliliters worth of blood. And then when your heart contracts and all that blood gets ejected, well, not all of that blood gets ejected. You'll have about 58 milliliters left in general. And that allows us to have enough, like, in there to, again, generate enough pressure to kind of move things around. Now, obviously, like that can change, depending on like, your heart size and everything like that. But in general, we are looking at like, if we're looking at controlling our heart, we need to be able to have like these specific like little conduction things that are going to allow that signal to take place. And that's where we're going to talk about what is called your sinoatrial or SA node. So if we're talking about like generating this electric signal, your SA node, your sinoatrial node, we term it the pacemaker of the heart. Okay. My apologies. I don't know if you guys can hear that. They're apparently landscaping today. Hopefully that's not too loud for you guys. So the sinoatrial node is this little node that lives right here inside your heart. Okay. And this guy creates the electric signal that runs your heart. Now, this is under the control of your nervous system, but it is not something that you have conscious control over. Like nobody in here, none of us can go, all right, heart, I want you to beat 6 times right now. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can't contract it the way you can contract skeletal muscle. Like I can choose to raise my arms. I can choose to wiggle around and do all this. I cannot choose to make my heart beat. It will continue beating without my control, depending on how it needs to beat, right? It is under the control of my nervous system, but it's under the control of what we call our autonomic, or it's your automatic nervous system, right? It's the stuff that you have involuntary control over. Now, you might make an argument and say, well, I could always think about something that makes me nervous, and then that makes my heart beat faster. So there, I controlled my heart rate. Or I can think calming thoughts, or I can control my breath, and that will slow my heart rate down. Yes, those things are true. You can do that. It doesn't mean that you have conscious control of your heart. You have conscious control of something that does have control of your heart. There's a difference, right? I can, tell someone to do something, or I can do something that, I cannot make, I don't know why this is the example that popped into my head. This is the weirdest example ever. I cannot make my roommate change his shirt, but I can pour orange juice on him, which will make him go change his shirt. Like you can't control your heart rate. You can control the things that will have an effect on your heart rate. So that's the difference there. It is autonomic, but the sinoatrial node is what is directly linked to your nervous system, and it is responding to your nervous system, and it's controlling your heart's rhythm. So that's why we call it the pacemaker of the heart, okay? Your sinoatrial node responds to chemical and nervous system signals that are running throughout the body. Particularly the big one is going to be what we call noradrenaline, which is adrenaline. And that will speed up your heart. So if you remember that scene from Pulp Fiction, I'm just gonna pull up a GIF of this rather than pull up the clip. But if you remember this crazy freaking scene from Pulp Fiction where he takes the needle and he stabs it in, she's like, "Ah!" And then there's like a freaking needle hanging out of her heart. That what he's doing is he's injecting her heart with adrenaline. And so then all of a sudden her heart is like, good God, and it just starts beating like crazy and it brings her back. So that's how adrenaline works. Like when you start exercising, for instance, you start producing adrenaline, and that adrenaline is now running through your blood. That blood runs through your heart, and your sinoatrial node is there going, woo, there's some adrenaline in here, right? And so it starts beating faster. It's not only adrenaline, there's other materials as well. Like for instance, if there is a lot of like very highly acidic blood that runs through your heart, again, the sinoatrial node is like, woof, we are acidic, and it will start pumping faster, right? If there's a lot of CO2 in your blood, which is making it acidic, that's kind of the same example, it will start pumping faster. And then also, like if you just start, watching a really exciting, scary movie or something, your nervous system will think that like, oh my gosh, we're in danger, and it will start producing things like adrenaline, which will speed up your heart. Or if you see like a loved one, like, so there's a lot of different things that kind of speed your heart rate up and slow your heart rate down, depending on like these, different nervous system signals, different chemicals, different chemistry in your blood, things like that. Now, the sinoatrial node is going to create the heart's signal. And then what will happen is it will actually travel over to what's called your AV node. There we go. This is a much better picture. So there's your sinoatrial node right here. It lives, by the way, and this is the thing you'll need to know about the sinoatrial node. They love to ask you two questions. They love to say, what is the pacemaker of the heart? That's the SA node. The SA node is the pacemaker of the heart. It creates the signal, right? And then the other question that they love to ask you is, where does it live? It lives in your right atrium. So that's, blood that's returning from the body, which makes sense because that's, if your body creates some adrenaline, right? It's got to get to your heart before your heart will start beating faster. So the first place that it's going to get would be that right atrium. We can get the signal as fast as possible if it lives there, and that's why it lives there. Now, here's what's kind of interesting. The first place it's going to travel after that, so it's going to create an electric signal, and it will run across the top of the heart here, which is going to run across those atriums first. And then the signal is going to travel down to this node right here. This node right here is called your AV node. That's your atrioventricular node. And it actually delays the signal. So we just talked about like why it's so important to create this signal as fast as possible. And then you got this AV node here, which is like, hold on. Okay, go ahead. Like it stops the signal for a second. And it does that because it gives the top of the heart time to finish its contraction before the bottom of your heart contracts. And that's why your heart, when it beats, kind of looks, yeah. Okay, there we go. Kind of looks like this, right? You'll notice it's going like top to bottom, right? You can see it's kind of going bop, bop, like this. And so the SA node, which would be over here, is going to finish its contraction in the top of the heart first, and then that will be delayed by the AV node. And then the AV node will finally let the signal go through, and that will allow the bottom of the heart to finish contracting afterwards. So the AV node delays the signal. And we can see that right here. So your SA node creates the signal, the AV node delays the signal that comes from the SA node so that different fibers of the heart can contract at different times. And then what will happen is it'll move from there and it'll branch out. And this doesn't look like it's branching very much, but just to show you what those branches actually kind of look like. Better picture. I don't know why I need so many pictures. Can't just get one good one from the beginning. So SA node, AV node, and it'll branch out down here, and it'll come to this place, which is the coolest freaking name in the heart. It's called your bundle of Hiss, which is such a cool name. And if I ever create like a heavy death metal band, I'm gonna name it Bundle of Hiss, and then it will spread out from there into what are called your Purkinje fibers. And your Purkinje fibers basically cover the rest of the heart, making sure that all of the heart muscle gets as much signal as possible. So your Purkinje fibers, various fibers running throughout the heart that allow the other heart cells to contract. So the SA node creates the signal, the AV node delays the signal, and the Purkinje fibers carry it throughout the rest of the heart. Cody, you gotta get out of here. All right, we'll see you tonight. So that is the different, like, we call it your conduction system within your heart. And so when you're actually looking at like a heartbeat on like an ECG, that should be enough, right? Yeah, you can actually see the various parts of like contraction that's happening, right? You can see like where the signal is created, and then you can see like as this whole sort of process is coming along here. Lorianne, did you ever have to do like ECG like analysis? Did you ever like glance at it and have to look at that stuff?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that's what you kind of see here. I actually, can I tell you what's so funny? I signed up for a like a medical study. They were looking for, we were talking about DOMS earlier. We were talking about delayed onset muscle soreness. They were doing a study on delayed onset muscle soreness, and they were looking for people who work out regularly, and it was going to pay like $1,800 to do like just a couple check-ins and work out a couple times a week. And I was like, hell yeah, I'll sign up for that. I was like really excited to do it. I go in, and they need to make sure that like you're a baseline regular person. So they do like a blood test, they do like a flexibility, they do all these things that are like, great, your blood pressure is great, your heart rate's great. We got to do an ECG real quick to make sure your heart functions. And I was like, okay, well, cardio athlete, I'm stoked to do this. This will be great. And I'm sitting there, and they have to, I'm very fuzzy, so they have to like shave parts of my, and put the little electrodes on and stuff. And the two nurses are like, is this the weird ECG machine? And I was like, chimed in. I was like, what do you mean weird ECG machine? Like, well, it just sometimes goofs up. And I was like, okay, why do you have that? Like, throw it away, like, but whatever. Didn't think anything of it. I'm sure it's going to be fine. And they run me through, and they were like, well, according to this, you're currently having a heart attack. And I was like, I can assure you that I am not. And it kept me out of the study. I was like, go get one of the other machines. And they were like, no, it's probably working just fine. And I was like, it says I'm having a heart attack. Are you kidding me? And they're like, you should probably follow up with your doctor. I was like, no, you should go get the other machine. I was so annoyed. And I didn't get to be a part of the whole thing because of it. I was so ticked off. I was having 2 types of heart attacks, by the way, simultaneously. Anyway, so that is your heart signal in a nutshell. The big thing they love to ask you about, guys, they probably, honestly, again, based on questions that I've seen NASA ask in the past, the ones they want you to know what the SA node is. It's the pacemaker of the heart that creates the electric signal. And then they want you to know where it lives. I don't know why they want you to, I mean, they want you to know where it lives because it makes a good test question, and they're just making sure you read the material. But basically the question they'll ask you is like, where is the SA node located? It's located in the right atrium. All right, any questions on the heart? We're gonna move into blood vessels next. Questions, you two? I got like an all ladies class today, which I don't think has happened in months.
Yeah.
Way over a year. There was a period of time where like the PFT program was like mostly late. I was like, this is crazy, because normally it's a very guy heavy program. All right. Well, let's look at blood vessels. So blood vessels. This is the systemic circuit of tubes of nearly, and I love this little weird fact, 60,000 miles, which could wrap around the earth, if I'm not mistaken, 2 3/4 times, of arteries, arterioles, capillaries, veins, and venules. Now, honestly, you're probably not going to see the term arterioles that often. You're probably not going to see the term venules all that often. Usually we simplify things down to you've got arteries, which are blood vessels that are traveling away from the heart. You got veins, which are vessels that are traveling towards the heart. And you got capillaries in the middle, which are the exchange sites, where you're actually covering tissues with these little blood vessels so that oxygen can interact with those tissues. But some of these darn things get so small, capillaries, they are so microscopically small, they are, if you were to lay them out end to end, which would be obviously very, very difficult, you get about 60,000 miles worth. If you've ever seen the bodies exhibit, blood vessels, so freaking cool. You can see like where they've kind of like laid out these blood vessels here. But like I said, it's a lot more than you're seeing here. They can't really get all the microscopic ones, there's actually, this looks very covered, but there's actually even more than you can see here. Your tissues are absolutely covered in capillaries. So this is responsible for delivering oxygen throughout the body, but also responsible for removing CO2 from the body, right? They have to act as an exchange site. This is where your blood cells are able to travel, right? So this, like I said, arteries are the largest blood vessels, and these are the ones that are carrying blood away from the heart. So an artery is always carrying blood away from the heart. Now, generally, you will see, actually, hold on. Arteries versus veins. Generally, you will see this drawn, like most of the time, we're going to draw arteries in red and veins in blue. Because again, arteries are carrying a blood away from the heart, which means that chances are it's very oxygenated blood that's, going throughout the body, right? Most of your arteries are traveling throughout your very large body. And then most of your veins are traveling back towards the heart, gathering blood that has dropped off its oxygen. So we'll usually draw these in blue. But it should be noted that there are 2 examples of where those colors are going to be flipped. An artery, what is important about memorizing arteries is that they always travel away from the heart. What's important about memorizing veins, they are always traveling towards your heart. Arteries always away, veins always towards. But where the colors get a little goofed up, you will sometimes, actually, here we go. Hold on. Vascular system. Let's see if that gives me what I want. Yeah, that'll work. But can I get a zoomed in one? There we go. Okay. Actually, sorry. I don't like it as much as I thought I would. There we go. All right. So what you can see here, you can't even see it. It's actually 2. Sorry. Finding a good picture. I'm always so picky about this. This has got to be high res. Yeah, that's what we're looking for. All right. So there are examples of, for instance, your pulmonary veins. Remember, veins always travel back towards your heart. Pulmonary veins are the ones that are coming from your lungs towards the heart. So that's actually highly oxygenated. And so like those veins that are traveling back towards your heart, there's a lot of oxygen in those. But it's a very short circuit. It's just coming from the lung straight over to the heart, a couple inches. Then once it's in the heart and it's going to get pumped out to the body, it'll travel through your arteries. And then on the flip side, you've also got pulmonary arteries, which are pumping blood away from the heart. Now, arteries are normally shown in bright red, but again, this is, blood that has to get to the lungs, and so it's very deoxygenated. So in the pulmonary versions of both of those blood vessels, you will sometimes see the colors will be flipped. And that's the only case. I'm making a big deal out of this because I also, Hank Green, the guy we watched in the video earlier, I always watch him in I subscribe to his Instagram, and someone asked the question the other day. They were like, why is blood blue, you know, instead of red? And he was talking about how it's like, well, blood is never blue. It's either dark red or bright red. But the pigment of your skin makes it appear bluish because your eyes are being fooled in how much, you know, in terms of like what light they can absorb and stuff. And then he's like, he mentions like, he's like, arteries are always traveling, you know, they're always shown as bright red and veins are always shown as bright blue. And then I was listening to that and I was like, did he forget about it? He's not being, you know, and then all of a sudden, like he had a second video afterwards and he was like, a bunch of people yelled at me. And he was like, I was being overly simplistic. You've got pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins where the colors will be flipped. And I was like, ah, there he is. So anyway, arteries, very large blood vessels. Here's what you need to remember. They carry blood away from the heart. That's what I want you to memorize. There are small versions of arteries. We call those arterioles, okay? So when they branch away smaller and smaller and smaller, right? Arteries, you know, they'll get tinier and tinier and tinier and tinier. So here you can kind of see, right? You get your aorta, which is the biggest, you know, it gets its own name, but it's technically an artery. Then you have like, you know, big artery here, like your femoral artery, and then it'll branch a little bit smaller. It'll branch a little bit smaller. When it gets really small, we start to call it an arteriole. And then eventually it forms like these little capillary beds, right? And those capillary beds look kind of like this, where they cover a tissue. And now it's really easy to exchange blood cells with that tissue. And that's going to make it really easy to exchange oxygen. Then we've got veins, which are blood vessels that carry blood towards your heart. So arteries carry blood away from the heart, veins carry blood towards the heart. Small versions of veins, we call those venules. And so what will happen is veins will, you know, or we got capillaries, and then they'll attach together. These capillaries will start to come together and form junctions, which will, you know, eventually become a venule. And then a bunch of venules will form junctions and come together. And eventually that'll become a vein. And then eventually you've got your vena cava, which are dumping blood right back into the heart. So if you look at them, you can kind of see, you know, the different sizes here. Like I said, arteries are the biggest ones. Arteries and veins are pretty darn similar in terms of like width, but you can see like how thick an artery is. And that's because blood pressure is much, much higher in an artery, right? Because there's so much more blood pressure traveling through this, because this is, again, traveling away from the heart. And so your heart just squeezed really hard. So there's a lot of blood running through it. We don't want that darn thing to pop. So it's very muscular to kind of be able to deal with that. Whereas veins are actually very, very flexible and very thin. And that makes them easy to carry blood under low pressure and make sure that it's very easy for blood to travel all the way back to your heart. And then the thinnest walls are going to be in your capillaries, which makes sense because these are literally microscopic. So I want to take a second to talk about capillaries. Again, they're forming these beds that are actually covering your tissues, right? We saw capillaries, you know, we saw it covering the tissues of, actually not getting a great picture here. We saw it covering our alveoli yesterday, right? We saw those capillary beds, you know, absolutely covering the alveoli. Well, they also cover like, you know, your skin, they cover like, you know, your muscles. And so they basically, you know, allow those tissues to kind of be able to like move and back and forth and exchange and stuff. Yeah, there we go. There's, you can see a tissue in the background there. And so your capillaries are covering it. And you can see like sometimes you'll see like burst capillaries. They are very, very small and they have very thin walls. It's very easy to break your capillaries. And so you'll see when that happens, you know, you'll see little things like this, right? That's a capillary that was basically leaking, and you can see that leak under the skin. The most common version of this would be a simple bruise, you know. You know, a bruise is basically, oh God, I shouldn't have looked this up. These are intense. A bruise is basically, you know, where a bunch of capillaries burst, and so blood is pooling under the skin, and it looks, you know, pretty intense. So that is what's happening there. So capillaries are, very small, and they are so microscopic, by the way. They are sometimes, and this is one of my favorite facts about capillaries, they are sometimes smaller than your red blood cells themselves. And it's like, how the heck can a tube, which the blood cell is traveling through, be smaller than the thing that's traveling through it? Well, this is one of the reasons why your blood cells, which we're going to look at later, your red blood cells, have that little donut shape to them. They kind of look like a little filled in, like they look like a little breath mint. That allows them to fold, and so they can actually fold and squeeze through a really tiny microscopic capillary, and that gives them a little bit more pressure, which makes it easier for them to eventually travel back to the heart, which there's not a lot of pressure to get blood back to your heart. So the fact that we are able to do it is pretty cool. And that's because of that pressure. We call that these little precapillary sphincters, which are basically like these little tubes that allow like pressure to build up, and then a little blood cell can pop through and move pretty quickly. But you've also got, like, in your veins have special little valves in them that prevent blood from backflowing. And that again also allows like blood to travel where it needs to go. So it's difficult to get blood back to your heart, guys. Like, your heart squeezes, blood moves away, that's great. But being able to like go to where it needs to go and then get all the way back to your heart is sometimes a little challenging. Your heart's only sucking blood back in so hard, right? Well, we've got a little bit of that capillary pressure that is allowing that to happen. And your veins have these little valves in them that only go in one direction. So when blood is pumping up, that's great. But then let's say like your heart relaxes for a second and that blood starts to fall back down, the valve will slam shut. And so then blood gets trapped. And so then the next time the valve opens up, it will only be able to travel upwards. Now, obviously, if you have blood pressure problems and blood starts to pool, especially in your lower legs, well, it can start to look like this. You can start to stretch out those veins and damage them, and then blood will start pooling. This is known, and then it will actually stretch them out. This is what is known as like a varicose vein. So when you look, you can actually see like a varicose vein is where those veins have actually been stretched out so much. This is usually due to a weak heart that is not, pulling blood and pushing blood the way that it's supposed to. So those are your blood vessels. Now, one other artery that we need to talk about in particular are your coronary arteries. Your coronary arteries are arguably the most important arteries in your body because they are the arteries, again, that is traveling away from the heart, just like any other artery would, but they are circling back around to the outside of your heart immediately, and they are supplying the heart itself with blood flow. So you would think that your heart would just be able to kind of passively absorb oxygen whenever there's like just blood in the heart itself. Like there's blood in the chamber. So you would think that like, okay, well, that's delivering oxygen, isn't it? Well, not really. Remember, the right chambers have no oxygen. So half your heart would die if that was the only way for us to absorb oxygen. So luckily, when blood gets ejected out of the heart from that left ventricle, some of it travels up to your brain, some of it circles around, travels out to the rest of your body, but there's these little arteries that branch off immediately. And the first thing that gets blood from the heart when the heart is pumping is the heart itself. So your coronary arteries right here are going to supply your cardiac muscle with plenty of oxygen and nutrients. It's sort of similar to when you're on an airplane and it's like, please secure your own mask before helping others, right? Like your heart understands that concept really well because you can't do any good if you're not around, and conscious. So your coronary arteries experience coronary blood flow, which is blood that is traveling directly to supplying the heart itself. This, by the way, is the leading cause of death in the Western world: lack of coronary artery blood flow. So coronary artery disease, the #1 killer of people in the US, is basically where cholesterol and other materials start to block these arteries that are supposed to supply our heart with blood. So you'll get like fatty deposits in there until you eventually end up with like plaque. You end up with things like blood clots, and then it just blocks it. And now your heart is not getting enough oxygen, and your heart cells start to die. Like in this picture here, we see necrosis of the tissue there, because that is what happens when you have a lack of oxygen somewhere. So that's what causes different types of heart attacks. So when we're looking at the function of our heart, it depends on how much blood flow the heart itself is able to give itself. If you cannot give your heart blood, the heart cells cannot live, right? So you do have two major branches here. You've got your right coronary arteries and your left coronary arteries. They're very similar. They just kind of branch off from one another, and they supply the right side and the left side with blood flow, okay? So reviewing everything we've talked about so far, each cycle in your heart is going to begin with an action potential starting in your sinoatrial node. That signal will travel over to your atrioventricular node, where the signal will be delayed for just a second. That's going to allow the sinoatrial node to contract this part of the heart, and then all of these bundles here to finish contracting the top of the heart. So once the top of the heart is finished, well, then the bottom of the heart is finally going to get its signal after the delay there. And then that will travel down to the bundle of His. Well, it will then branch out to what we call our Purkinje fibers, which will allow the rest of the heart to finish contracting. And so your heart will kind of beat something kind of like this, right? Top to bottom. And that's allowing those different chambers to open up and create pressure. And then the different chambers on the bottom to open up and create pressure. You know, they're all kind of closing at a different rate. And that way we're all working together rather than, you know, trying to all just contract randomly. In fact, when someone is experiencing like fibrillation, you know, when someone's having like a heart attack, one of the reasons you use a defibrillator, those little paddles, and you're like, clear, right? The reason you do that is because that is zapping the heart with enough electricity to stop the heart. A lot of people think that's starting your heart back up. It's actually not true. Your heart is actually trying to contract. It's just quivering. It's fibrillating. So when you zap it with enough electricity, the whole thing shuts down, and then the sinoatrial node is able to be like, all right, everybody on my signal. And then it all gets going in its normal rhythm again, and the heart starts to beat the way it's supposed to. And that's why we all have to know how to use an AED machine, so we can learn how to zap people if they have a heart attack at the gym. So what's really cool is you have to be able to match your coronary blood flow to your oxygen demand. You know, compared to skeletal muscle, your heart uses a lot more oxygen. Remember, we talked about the more mitochondria your cells have, the more oxygen they're going to consume. This is why a high VO2 max shows that we have somebody who's in very good shape, because they have muscles that are eating a lot of oxygen. Well, compared to skeletal muscle, your heart has way more mitochondria. About 40% of all your heart cells are made up of mitochondria, right? So that means that they are eating a ton of oxygen, which makes sense because your heart is the most aerobic freaking thing ever. Remember, we talked about glycolysis versus aerobic metabolism, right? Anaerobic versus aerobic. Anaerobic lasts what, 2 minutes at the most? And then anything beyond 2 minutes is aerobic. Again, your heart is going to beat for 80, 90, 100 years, you know? That's pretty aerobic. That's definitely longer than 2 minutes, right? So it needs to have a lot of mitochondria to be able to produce energy on the go consistently. This is one of the reasons why when we're measuring how strong someone's heart is, during exercise, we are measuring, like, you know, we're looking for a low resting heart rate. The lower your resting heart rate is, in general, and obviously there's some exceptions to the rule, in general, that shows us that you have a heart that's in very good shape because it's able to deliver oxygen in less beats per minute. So the lower the heart rate is at rest and during exercise, the more efficient the heart generally, as long as they don't have like a medication or bradycardia or anything like that. And like I said, this is all under the control of your nervous system, the unconscious part of your nervous system, and the panicky unconscious part of your nervous system. It's under the control of your sympathetic nervous system. That's part of the automatic system that's responsible for increasing your heart rate. And then your parasympathetic nervous system would slow your heart rate back down. So nervous system, you've got conscious and unconscious. In the unconscious part, you've got panic, that's fight or flight, or relax, that's rest and digest. Those are either going to speed up or slow your heart rate down. Whew, all right, so that's the anatomy and physiology of the heart. Any questions on that so far, guys? Pretty detailing questions? No? Feeling good?
I can't see it. No.
Oops. Okay. Water going down the wrong pipe. All right, so now let's move into the trainer side of things, right? Let's talk about us. Let's talk about like how we pay attention, like what is a healthy heart, right? Well, now we're gonna look at, a heart that's working. So calculating how your heart works actually requires some pretty sophisticated equipment if we're being very sophisticated about it. But you know what? We know how the heart works physiologically, right? We just talked about how like if your heart's not very efficient, it has to beat more. If it's really efficient, it can beat less and get the same amount of work done. And so that's where we're going to start looking at like calculating how your heart's actually going to work. So one of the things we look at is what's called your myocardial oxygen consumption. Again, this is a very complicated look at how your heart works, right? But basically, we are looking at like how much oxygen your heart's consuming. That's going to require some pretty sophisticated equipment, which we're not going to have access to in a gym. So instead, we just remember this principle. It's called the Fick principle. And it's a principle that's used to calculate your cardiac output as the quotient of total body oxygen consumption divided by the difference in oxygen content. And basically, this is what it states, right? If we know that your heart will have to beat faster whenever oxygen content is low, well, then we know that a heart that is beating faster means that there is low oxygen content, which means it's not delivering oxygen very efficiently. The faster your heart is beating, the less efficient your heart is, in simpler terms, right? So generally, your SA node is going to make your heart beat about 70 beats per minute for an average person. So our average resting heart, an average heartbeat is about 70 beats per minute. Now, obviously, that might sound a little bit skewed. Like I'm sitting here talking and like I'm pretty animated and my heart rate is around 70 beats per minute. So I'm not even at a true resting heart rate. You guys will probably know that like your heart rate might be a little bit lower than 70 beats per minute. That shows us that your heart is in really good shape, which makes sense because this is a school for freaking personal trainers, people who have exercised kind of regularly, right? So I know I get sometimes students who are like, that seems really high. No, that's actually pretty average. So now obviously it could go even lower. And sometimes it can get dangerously low. We'll see what's called a condition called bradycardia. That's a decrease in heart rate. So if it goes to like less than 60, sometimes that can be a sign of bradycardia. If it's above 70, sometimes we'll call that tachycardia. That's a heart rate that's beating too quickly. But basically all of this is under the control of your nervous system by triggering your SA node to cause your heart to beat more often, right? So when we're looking at this, and by the way, we're also going to sometimes look at this. This is not something that's ever going to come up for us, but sometimes you'll look at things like pulse pressure, and that's the difference between like your systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So the difference like 120/80, that'd be a difference of 40, right? And we would look at like how your heart is actually your brain is controlling all of that. I'm going to actually move past that here because that's not something that's ever going to come up for us. But there is this concept called the Frank-Starling law, and it basically states that like the more stretched your heart is, the more of a volume there's going to be that like controls it, and your heart is communicating with your brain to experience that stretching sensation. So you can see your brain is going to travel down like your medulla here, which will then travel down your spinal column, and then it will have, it's communicating with these 5 major parts of the heart there. Again, don't worry too much about that. The big takeaway for us is, your heart and your brain are kind of working together. But as we're looking at it, during rest and during, we call it rest submaximal, which means like you're doing work, but you're not working as hard as you can. And during maximal exercise, so you are working as hard as you can. During any of those, this is going to increase your nervous system's activity, right? And it's going to trigger your nervous system to work harder. But the more often you do it, this is what's kind of fun, it will actually increase parasympathetic activity, which is the relaxation part of your nervous system. This is why exercising regularly creates endorphins, which makes you relax, and why exercise can be used as a stress reducer, even though what we're literally doing is going to the gym to get stressed. That's what's kind of funny about this, right? Like, we are going to the gym and we are putting our body through stress, but that causes us to be better at dealing with stress, which calms us down in general in our lives. This is why exercise is so freaking good for us. Well, it's one of the reasons why exercise is so freaking good for us, right? Endurance athletes, for instance, have been shown to have some of the lowest, levels of like stress in their body when compared with like other types of athletes, and especially when compared with like average people. So that's one of the things that we're looking at in terms of like cardiovascular training. Not only will it make your heart more efficient, it will also reduce the amount of stress. So when we're calculating how your heart actually works, the big thing that I want you guys, I'd say the biggest thing that you're going to pay attention to today that they love to ask questions on is related to your cardiac output. So cardiac output is the overall performance of your heart. Okay, that's its definition here. So sometimes they'll ask you like, what is cardiac output? And they want the definition. It's the overall performance of the heart. Or sometimes they will ask you the equation for how to calculate cardiac output, which is very simple, guys. It's your heart rate times your stroke volume, okay? So there's two things that make up cardiac output, right? It's made of your heart rate, that's the number of beats per minute, and the stroke volume, the amount of blood that's ejected per beat. So heart rate, number of beats in 1 minute's time. Stroke volume, amount of blood ejected per beat. Now, we can't measure stroke volume in a gym. We can do it if we had like really sophisticated equipment. We can't measure it in the gym, right? But what we can pay attention to is the heart rate. And we know that because both of these things are related to one another, like if you can pump a lot of blood per beat, you don't have to beat as often. So then if I put you through some intense exercise and your heart beats slowly in response, I'm like, good Lord, you must be pumping a lot of blood every time your heart beats because your heart rate's not going up. You're in really great shape. But if I put you through very little exercise and then all of a sudden your heart's beating like super, super fast trying to keep up, that means that it's not pumping very much blood every single time. I always like to use this analogy. Imagine if I had to move 1,000 pounds worth of plates, 1,000 pounds worth of like 5-pound plates, over to the other side of the, like down a hallway, right? That's 200 little 5-pound plates, right? Isn't it? Yeah. So if I'm really strong, maybe I can carry, like 10 of those plates at a time, and it's only going to take me a couple trips, right? But if I'm really weak and I can only carry 1 plate at a time, I'm going to have to make more trips. And if I want to get it done in the same amount of time, well, in one version, I can move at a pretty leisurely pace. And the other version, I'm going to have to be sprinting back and forth because I'm not carrying very much every single time, right? That's cardiac output. So there's equation. Here's how we write that equation out. Cardiac output, or Q, which is the quotient of your heart, equals heart rate times stroke volume. If the stroke volume is low, the heart rate has to be high. If the stroke volume is high, the heartbeat can be low. So that's one of the reasons why we pay attention to our clients' resting heart rates. The lower your resting heart rate, the better in shape your heart is. And we know that because we're calculating it out. This is why you guys remember when we did the YMCA step test, right? We measured how quickly their pulse returned to normal after putting them through a specific amount of stress. If it returned to normal really quickly and their heart rate was low, great, you're in good shape. If it returns slowly, maybe we need to do a little bit more cardio. So that is what we're looking at when it comes to like resting and during submaximal exercise. Questions on that, guys?
Just got to review.
Yeah. Is there anything that's not clear? This is probably the most important concept. I'd say like on the whole day, this is the big thing that they love to ask about. Feeling good? Okay. It's just you two, so please feel free. If you got questions, let me know.
Okay.
All right. And then hold on just one second. I'm gonna peek forward here. Yeah, it's gonna skip into VO2 next. Okay. The one thing that the PowerPoint doesn't do a great job of like going into blood pressure. So I just put these notes in here because you may get a question about it. And I know it's not in the PowerPoints here. There we go. Okay. So one last thing here. We've got blood pressure to talk about. That's the last component of our cardiovascular system, right? So blood pressure is another way that we can tell how good a shape your cardiorespiratory system is in. We want your blood pressure to be low because that means that it's very easy for blood to flow throughout the body. If blood pressure is really high because maybe your blood vessels are stiff or they're covered in materials, it's like a hose that you're pinching, right? If it's really stiff, that blood's going to come, that water is going to come shooting out of there intensely, right? And that can damage our body. Or if there's just like, stuff in the hose, again, pressure is going to come out really intensely, or maybe it's not going to flow at all. So generally we want our blood pressure to be about 120/80. And what that means is we want your systolic blood pressure, that's the pressure during a contraction of the heart, to be about 120 units of pressure. Okay. So when your heart squeezes, pressure is going to be at its highest. The highest we want it is around 120. And then when your heart relaxes, the pressure in your blood vessels is going to be much, much lower. That's your diastolic pressure. And that's the pressure during a relaxation. We want that to be around 80. What's up, Lorianne?
Oh, I'm sorry. Nothing.
Oh, okay. So again, like you've got systole, which is the contraction, diastole, systole, diastole, right? And again, that's your heart beating, right? Systole, diastole, systole, diastole. So systolic pressure around 120, diastolic. If it's ever at 140 or over 90 or higher, we consider that hypertension. That's high blood pressure, and that's a cause for concern. That's going to make it hard for blood to be able to travel wherever it is we need it to get to, So again, we've got type 1 fibers. Remember we talked about type 1 fibers in muscles. You got type 2 fibers. Those are the really strong ones. Type 1 fibers are the ones that are oxidative. That's your aerobic. Most of your heart is very much, well, I should say all of your heart is very much type 1 fibers. Lots of mitochondria, lots of contractions. So when we're looking at this and we're looking at oxygen consumption, the more mitochondria you have, the more oxygen you are can consume. So when it comes to training the heart, cardiovascular exercise will increase your heart's efficiency by developing those type 1 fibers. The more often you can get your heart to beat more often, weird sentence, the more you will develop those type 1 fibers. And so type 1 fibers are muscle fibers that contain a large quantity of mitochondria and a large quantity of oxidative enzymes. That oxidative enzymes one, by the way, doesn't get enough credit whenever we're talking about exercise. Like whenever we talk about exercise, we're always like, yeah, you're making more mitochondria. To be fair, you're also making a lot of enzymes, which make you better at using those mitochondria. This is why, like, if you take like 2 weeks off from exercise and then you go back to the gym, sometimes it feels like you're really struggling. Enzymes don't live that long inside the body. And so what you're feeling is like, you're like, oh my God, I'm so detrained. My body is, honestly, you're not that detrained, but it feels really rough because you don't have as many enzymes. You can remake them, a week or two of consistent exercise, you'll be right back in the saddle. And I always have clients who freak out when they get back from vacation. They're like, oh no, I'm in so much worse shape. And it's like, honestly, you're actually probably fine. It feels much worse though, because you just don't have as many of those enzymes. All my ultimate people have been feeling that, coming back from quarantine. So type 1 fibers are metabolically reliant on mitochondria and oxygen to produce energy. And so through extended duration, your body will create more of those enzymes. It will create more mitochondria in response. If you do lots of like sustained exercise, your body will go, wow, we need more mitochondria to keep up with this sustained exercise that we're doing. And so it'll do it. It'll create that mitochondria. Now, the more mitochondria you have in your body in general, but also specifically in your heart, the more you will consume oxygen whenever it enters your body. So we want to consume as much oxygen as possible because that shows that we have a really efficient body that's using lots of energy, right? This is why VO2 max, or volume of oxygen consumed max, maximal amount of volume of oxygen consumed, is one of the best ways to test your clients to see how good of quote unquote shape they are in. So VO2 max is the maximal volume of oxygen consumed by the body. As intensity climbs, the volume of oxygen will also climb, but eventually you're going to hit a point where you're like, I can't bring in any more oxygen. I've only got so many red blood cells. I've only got a heart that can pump so much blood. I've only got lungs that have enough enzymes. You know, like you've only got enough pieces of equipment because maybe you haven't developed them, right? So eventually you will hit this maximum place. That's your VO2 max. So when we look at like VO2 max, you know, there's sort of different ways that we're measuring this here, right? Not that button. Actually, you know what? Give me a men's and a women's. Give me both together. Really? All right. Let's look at the women's. I don't know why I'm not getting it together. So here's a VO2 max chart for women, right? So if you are, you know, between the ages of 20 and 29, and you're consuming, you know, 33 milliliters worth of oxygen for every kilogram of your body weight, that's pretty good. You're doing decent, you know. If you're up over 41, you're killing it. Pro athletes, they can be, you know, you'll sometimes see like, hold on, actually, you know what? Let's see here. And I know he was a big fat cheater, but what was Lance Armstrong's VO2 max? Yeah, his VO2 max was as high as 85. This is part of the reason why he was doping, because it can raise your VO2 max because you'll have more red blood cells to carry more oxygen. Lance Armstrong, by the way, yeah, he was a big fat cheater, but he participated in both types of blood doping. Blood doping is where you'll take this hormone called EPO, which will make your body create more red blood cells. And then he was also donating he was not donating. He was taking out his own blood, like donating it into a pool, and then keeping it in like refrigerators along the Tour de France. And then he would inject his own blood back into his body, which, you know, you take it out, your body makes new red blood cells, and then you put more, and now you have more blood in your body. It's incredibly dangerous. It makes you a cardio beast, but it is incredibly dangerous because now you have thicker blood, and your heart's going to have a hard time squeezing them. You've only got so much volume in your blood vessels. But here's the thing. Lance Armstrong's heart was about 20% larger than the average person's heart for his body size. So his heart could keep up with blood doping. He was genetically designed to be an excellent cheater, which is crazy. It's a real bummer, man, because the freaking Livestrong organization is incredible and very a force for good in this world. But you know, anyway, that's Lance Armstrong. So anyway, the average VO2 max you can see here. You know, if you're up over 41, you are crushing, right? Men's, it's a little bit higher. You'll see charts a little bit different here. You know, if you're up above 52, you're crushing it. So how the heck do we calculate your VO2 max? Well, there's a lot of different assessments out there. The most accurate of which is going to be that test that we talked about yesterday, where you do a maximal bout of activity. So the exercise protocol will involve increasing your activity to its absolute highest until eventually you are consuming all of the oxygen. You will hit a VO2 plateau, and that will be identified as your VO2 max. Okay, so it is the maximal amount of oxygen you consume. So this machine is measuring how much oxygen is coming in versus how much CO2 is coming out. And so when you guys are at rest, we call that your respiratory exchange ratio. Okay, so your respiratory exchange ratio is the ratio of oxygen consumed versus the amount of oxygen that you're exhaling. You know, so generally, guys, when you're at rest, you're only consuming about 70% of the oxygen you bring in. So if you brought in, like, we'll say 10 units of oxygen and you exhaled 7 units of CO2, the remaining 3 units didn't get used. So you end up exhaling some oxygen. This is why CPR works. If you were consuming all of the oxygen, giving somebody rescue breaths would not do anything for them. It would be completely unhelpful. But luckily, there's about 30% of oxygen that goes unused when you're at rest. This is also one of the reasons why you should take turns when performing CPR if there's a second person who knows how to do it present. You take turns not only because it keeps you from getting fatigued, but also because it keeps your respiratory exchange ratio hopefully pretty low. And so the quality of air coming out is higher in oxygen. Now, obviously, there's going to be a moment where if you're sprinting and you're working as hard as you can, there is no oxygen coming out, right? You are, any oxygen going in gets used, right? That is where you hit a 1.0 or 100% oxygen consumption. And that is what the VO2 test is going to push you towards. So the way you do this test, or the protocol we used to use when I used to do these tests for people, is we would use the cardio coach, we'd put them on a treadmill, and I would say, all right, we're going to get you, to your baseline. So they would stand and just measure, and the machine would go, great, go ahead and start the test. I would go, okay. So I'd hit the start button. And by the way, they were in a heart rate monitor the entire time, not because it has anything to do with their VO2, but because we're measuring like where their heart rate is when their VO2 is this. That way you don't have to friggin' measure your VO2 every time you go into a gym. You can just pay attention to your heart rate. And you know that if your heart rate is this, your VO2 is that. So I'd put them on the treadmill and I'd start them at like 3 miles per hour, gentle walking. And then we would raise the incline by 1, and then we would raise the miles per hour by 1. So then all of a sudden it was 4 miles per hour with a 1 incline. Then it would be a 2 incline, and then next minute, and it was every minute on the minute. So minute 1, we'd raise it to 4 miles per hour. Minute 2, 4 miles per hour plus 1 incline. Minute 3, 5 miles per hour. Minute 4, 5 miles per hour plus 1 incline. So it would go up and we would just go back and forth in both. And that way, eventually they are sprinting uphill, because we want this test to be done as quick as possible. We don't want this, not an endurance test, it's an oxygen consumption test. So we would push them, and then all of a sudden the machine would be like, all right, 85% of the oxygen is getting consumed, 90% of the oxygen is getting consumed. All right, it's official. The only thing they are exhaling is pure CO2. And then you would have them try to push it as long as they can maintain it, which obviously is not going to be very long, because what's happening at this point is now their body is producing more CO2, or needs to produce more CO2 than it can handle, right? The cells are like, all right, give us more oxygen. It's like, I've only got so much oxygen to go around. I can't supply anymore, right? So then lactic acid starts to build up. Your client starts to get super, super exhausted, and they have to slow down eventually. And so once they're done, you hit stop on the treadmill, get them back to a walking pace so they can cool down, hit stop on the machine, and then it will tie all that information together, and it'll give them a readout that kind of looks like this. VO2 test readout. Oh, come on, give me the cardio coach There we go. Let's try print out. That'll surely give me what I need. Yeah, there we go. You'll get a little page that looks kind of like this. That is low quality, so I can't, you guys won't be able to see that. Oh, come on, give me zoom in and still be okay. All right, well, I'll just tell you what it says. So what it says is like, remember, they wore a heart rate monitor while they were consuming all this oxygen. So we'll say like, here's where exercise begins, maybe a heart rate of 130 for you. And then your maximal intensity you really want to push yourself to is here. And then also shows you how many calories you're burning per hour, which is pretty cool. And then it shows you like, if you're ever in this green zone, your cardio is getting better. And if you're ever in this red zone, your peak is getting better. And so you're actually looking at like your cardio zone versus your peak zone. And that's how we can train. And then there's also the fat burning zone on there, but the fat burning zone is silly anyways. We'll talk about that later this mod. So that's what your respiratory exchange ratio in VO2 is. Your exchange ratio is how much oxygen is being used versus how much is not being used. As you train to develop higher, you will be able to consume more oxygen. You'll be able to have a higher consumption of oxygen molecules, right? And so that will increase your power output by your body's cells. That's why VO2 max is such a great indicator of cardiovascular health. Now there is a couple other little things in here. Obviously, you guys might notice if you've ever started doing cardio, it almost feels like you're kind of getting the gunk out in the beginning. Like I know when I go to like play ultimate, the first point is always like blah, blah, blah. You get the build up and you're like that's the couple things that are happening there. Number one, your metabolism is just kicking into aerobic, which it needs to get used to first. And then number two, there's also a little bit of preload in the heart. Your heart has a hard time keeping up because it's like, oh, are we exercising? I thought we were sitting on the couch. So it's the volume of blood that stretches the heart just before like a contraction. So preload will kind of hit a little bit harder. And it's like, kind of similar to like when you first stretch in the morning, you're like, oh, okay, now I'm good to go. Your heart experiences that as well. So summarizing everything up, if we're looking at how the efficiency of the heart is, an individual with a heart rate that is a resting heart rate that's 10 beats lower shows an increase in myocardial efficiency. It means that your heart is getting stronger, which means we can draw the assumption that your VO2 max is also probably improving because you are consuming more oxygen. So there should be a slight decrease in the quotient of your cardiac output at rest during submaximal exercise, meaning that like whenever you are working really hard, your heart rate will slow down in response. That shows us that you are getting into better shape. Now, obviously, VO2 max is probably one of the best ways to measure someone's cardiovascular health, but there's some limits, you can see like there's a little bit of difference between like how much hemoglobin you're producing, that can slow your VO2 max down. If your lung capacity is diminished, that can lower your VO2 max. Remember, this is oxygen consumption, not amount of air that's coming into your lungs, but they are absolutely like, connected. And then there's the concentration of red blood cells versus like total blood volume. If you go to like high elevation, for instance, the composition of air is a little bit different on top of Mount Everest, but the ratio is actually the same. So here's the thing, right? Take a look over here. We see air is always contains about 21% oxygen, but there's less oxygen available at high elevation. So the ratio is the same in terms of like what gases are here, right? But the concentration is much lower for both. So when you go to like Mount Everest, because there's such a little amount of oxygen, your body will actually create more red blood cells and more hemoglobin in response. It will use iron to be like, all right, well, we need to create more hemoglobin because there's not enough oxygen. That'll increase your blood's affinity for gathering oxygen. Then when you get back to sea level, you're gonna feel like a freaking world star athlete. When you get back to sea level, you're like, there's so much oxygen in the air. You're like, your blood cells are like, I can absorb so much, and you'll feel like a cardio phenom. And then that'll go away in about 2 weeks. Actually, it'll go away in a couple of days, about 72 hours, I think. Doesn't last very long. But that's why you'll hear people say that they train high and they race low. They'll train in like North Carolina or Wyoming, and then they'll race in like, sea level here, in Los Angeles or something. So that is basically everything about the cardiorespiratory system. So kind of really quickly just reviewing, because there's not a summary slide here. Your cardiovascular system is your heart, blood, and blood vessels. Your heart is this muscular organ that has 4 chambers in it, 2 atriums, which gather blood that returns from the heart, and 2 ventricles, which pump blood out of the heart. The left ventricle is pumping blood throughout the body, so it's very oxygenated blood, and the right ventricle is pumping blood to the lungs, so it's very deoxygenated blood. That way it can become oxygenated. You got 3 different heart layers: the epicardium, which is the outermost layer, the myocardium, which is the thick muscular layer. When we're talking about the heart contracting, that's the layer that's doing it, and the endocardium, which is the innermost layer. That contraction is controlled by your SA node, or your sinoatrial node. It is the pacemaker of the heart. And it can, controls how often your heart signal is beating. Your heart is connected to about 60,000 miles worth of blood vessels, arteries, which are carrying blood away from the heart, veins, which are carrying blood towards the heart, and capillaries, which are in the middle, where actually oxygen and other nutrients are being exchanged with the various tissues of the body. In your blood, you've got a lot of different components. You've got platelets and plasma and red blood cells. The one we spend most of our time talking about is red blood cells. This is what is actually carrying oxygen and other nutrients throughout the body. When we're looking at how your heart is working, we're going to pay attention particularly to cardiac output, which is the overall performance of the heart. That's your number of beats per minute, which is your heart rate, times the amount of blood that's being pumped per contraction, which is your stroke volume. And when we're training the heart, we are primarily training our heart to get better at aerobic metabolism. So that's making it even better at type 1 muscle fiber contractions, and making it good at consuming oxygen consistently. The more oxygen you can consume, the better in shape you are, because you have more mitochondria. And that's why VO2 max, or volume of maximal oxygen consumption, is such a good way to test, how in shape somebody is. So paying attention to a low resting heart rate is one good way to see how strong the heart is. Testing how much oxygen someone can consume is a great way to test how, in general, good shape they're in, overall. Whew. And that's the big one. There's a lot of terminology in this one today. This is why by the way, this all used to be one big. The last 2 days used to be one big PowerPoint. That's why we split them up.
I'm pooped.
Yeah, I know. Me too. I hear you. But you guys got anything for me today? You feeling good?
I'm going to review, but yeah, that was a lot of info. Yeah, I agree.
Luckily, we will have another full day dedicated to the heart next module. So it will be coming back around in a much more NASM approach to things. Actually, we're going to look at the heart twice next mod, which is pretty helpful. Yeah, it'll be clear for sure. All right.
So what are we doing tomorrow?
What's that?
What's tomorrow?
Tomorrow is the muscular system, I believe. Let me make sure I'm not lying. Muscles or nutrition is tomorrow. Muscles, neuromuscular. So a little bit about like the brain as well. But the brain and muscles tomorrow. It'll be fun.
And then Thursday Friday.
Thursday we're meeting up.
Friday.
The midterm will go up on Thursday, and then Friday we'll be back in the metabolism side of things.
Okay, good. All right, thanks, Brad.
Cool. See you guys.
Bye.
Okay, bye guys.
Bye.